Hi everyone, and we're back to read another chapter of Vanya, a true story. There we go. Vanya, true story by Myrna Grant. And we are at chapter 8. And the little reading before that is, in the front is, you shared your bread with me, and in the act gave me back all Russia. Oh, sorry, I have just one hand here today. There we go. Try and hold this still. The end of winter was unseasonably warm for Kerch. Lace circles of light snow still fell lazily in the early mornings, but the rigor of training eased a little in the milder temperatures. The Politruck had warned Ivan to say nothing about his assignment in Sverdlovsk, an order easy to obey since his every moment was engaged in a hectic program of catching up to his unit in military and political studies. In addition, he had been assigned as chauffeur to Colonel Malson himself, with sudden and unpredictable calls for his service. Once in a while, when he was seated in class with the other soldiers, Ivan's sped-up world seemed to slow down and blend momentarily into a peaceful whole. The horrors of Sverdlovsk were retold but once. As spring came, Ivan began to notice a wonderful thing happening, even on days when a time of prayer was impossible. Increasingly, he was experiencing an almost overwhelming sense of the presence of God. Love blazed like an icon candle inside him. He was astonished that no blast of injustice from outside caused it to flicker. Even tonight, hurrying to the evening lecture on scientific atheism, he felt no impatience. He was tired, his muscles ached, but praise to God welled up in his heart. There had been no need for haste. The soldiers were clustered around a glowing heater in the front of the classroom, joking as they faced the red electrical coils. Ivan sat down and rested his head on the arm of his desk. His bunkmate, Vladimir Olbu, noticed him and was not surprised that he could sleep, even in such clamor. The wall clock showed several minutes after the hour. The instructor was still missing from the room. The men began diffidently to take their seats, unwillingly to leave the comfort of the heater, yet uneasy at being found in the wrong place if an officer suddenly arrived after all. But the time wore on. Suddenly, Vladimir had an idea. Let's have our own lecture. Let's have a political debate. Interest stirred slightly. That would be one way of passing the time. No one dared to leave the classroom without an order. Our comrade Ivan Vasilievich has sometimes taken a stand against the theories of this class, yet we have not heard his position fully articulated. We shall debate the question, what is the difference between Ivan's God and our God, which he claims is the state? Ivan had been praying before the class began. Now, with an inward lift, he agreed to the debate. Some of the men pulled out their cigarettes and twisted towards him in their chairs. There was an intensity in the classroom. Vladimir started it off. All right, Ivan, who is your God? Ivan's pleasure at what looked like an opportunity to preach to the class was short-lived. My God, he began, is almighty and all-powerful. In the middle of the room A sergeant from Armenia coughed on his cigarette and stamped impatiently on the floor. He groaned in expiration. Just a minute, Moseyev. Your God is all-powerful? Yes. He can do anything? Yes. The sudden challenge in the sergeant's eyes was unmistakable. The soldier stared in enjoyment. If your God is all-powerful and can do anything, prove it. Murmurs of assent came from all corners of the room. Ivan's life had awakened disturbing questions in many minds. The sergeant spoke loudly. If your God can do anything, let him get me a leave tomorrow to go home. Then I'll believe in him. Fair enough, Vladimir exclaimed. Here would be something scientific. Black and white. Yes or no? Leaves were rare. There should be nothing inconclusive and mysterious about a contest like this. Responses to the challenge came quickly. Yes, Ivan Vasilievich, I've listened to you. Up to now, everything you've said sounds like fairy tales. But if your God gives Pyotr Alexandrov Prokhorov a leave, then we'll believe there's a God in the sky. Right, if your God does it, we will believe that he is a living God and can do everything. Most certainly, let your God prove himself. Then even we will believe. Gazing at the excited men, Ivan prayed fervently in his spirit. The soldiers waited, gradually sobered by the earnest struggle they could see in Ivan's face. Lord, can this be from you? Will you be tempted by men? What they ask, is it right, Lord? Come on, Ivan Vasilievich, let's prove your living God. The sergeant shifted uneasily in his chair. Somehow the challenge was being taken too seriously. Suddenly, Ivan thought of the Old Testament contest between the prophets of Baal and Elijah. With a new inward quietness, he asked again for direction. Unmistakably, the words came into his consciousness. Tell them, I will do this. Every eye in the room stared as Ivan answered. His voice had an assurance that astonished the men. Turning to the sergeant, he spoke clearly enough for every person to easily hear his reply. Tomorrow the Lord says you will go home on leave. Now you must do what I tell you to. Throw away your cigarette. The sergeant obeyed. And now pull the pack out of your pocket. With an elaborate shrug, Prokhorov produced his pack of cigarettes. Pulling himself up from his desk, he walked slowly to the heater and dropped the pack behind the red-hot grate. In a moment, it flared up and burned brightly. For the first time, Ivan noticed that a large crowd of soldiers had gathered at the two side doors of the lecture room, spilling over into a line around the walls of the room. A stillness, like an invisible mist, seemed to hang in the air. Finally, the spell was broken by the arrival of several breathless officers. The evening class began. It wasn't until after taps that Ivan was able to speak again with the sergeant. He found himself lying sleepless on his bunk, staring at the sprinkle of stars he could see from the window nearby. The assurance of Ivan's reply had unnerved him. He had been able to think of nothing else all evening. It was absurdity, but over and over he found himself in a state of excitement. He half believed that something might happen in the morning. "There is so much talk about you, comrade." Ivan's voice was a whisper. Prokofiev raised himself on one elbow, putting his blanket over his shoulder. "Why aren't you asleep, Moseyev?" Ivan smiled. "Because there is much to talk to you about. Since you will become a believer tomorrow, there are many things I must tell you." "You're crazy, Moseyev. Why don't you go back to bed? And you're going to get a cold." Pyotr Prokofiev squinted nervously at Ivan in the dark. The story of Moseyev standing all night in below zero December weather flashed into his mind. He was reassured to see that Ivan carried his blanket with him and swept it around himself as he huddled on the end of Prokofiev's bunk. "You said you would believe if God gives you a leave tomorrow morning." "Of course, many of us said we would believe. But it is for you, Pyotr Alexandrovich, that God is going to do this miracle. I must tell you what the Bible teaches." In spite of a feeling of uneasiness, Prokofiev's interest was captured by the things Moseyev said. Never before had he heard such an idea. Such ideas spoken with such absolute conviction. The teachings of the Bible were a world away from the strange icons he had seen in museums or the bizarre stories he had been told about the Christian scriptures. Was it possible that the emptiness in himself he had long ago accepted as part of the human condition was a longing for God, as Moseyev said? If God exists. "Is there a prayer house in your city?" The sergeant was amused. "You mean for the old ladies? Anyway, I don't think so." It's not only old ladies who go. Many men, many young people. They will be able to help you. I can find out for you some names of believers in your city, but it will take some time. The brethren in church will know. "There are people that believe like you do in church and in my own city." Ivan grinned suddenly. "Of course. And you are going to minister joy to them when you tell them that what the Lord has done. What praises they will raise, how they will welcome you." Prokofiev felt intensely uncomfortable. In the meetings of believers, there will be some who have Bibles. At least one of the pastors will have a Bible, probably most. Someone sometime will lend you scriptures to read, and they will suggest where to begin. "I'm sorry I have no Bible to lend you. For the moment, you will have to believe what I say is true. I want to tell you all I can of what the Bible says. We must discuss the world and man and sin and God's plan for man's salvation." The night wore on as the whispered monologue became a discussion. 2 hours before reveal, Prokofiev stood and stretched quietly as Ivan ended in prayer. "Moseyev, my head is so full of ideas. I may never sleep again. But thank you, comrade. Morning comes." At the end of the sound of the bugle, Ivan woke immediately with a thrill of expectation. This would be a wonderful day. For once, he was eager for the morning ordeal of long-distance running. Perhaps he might find Sergei and be able to tell him about Prokhorov and what the Lord had promised to do. But unexpectedly, there was to be no morning drill for Ivan. The night delivery of bread had not been made. Ivan would leave for Kerch and pick up the bread supply that would be needed for breakfast. Ivan climbed into the cab of the small truck, singing as he turned the key in the ignition. When he pulled back into the base, almost an hour later, he was surprised at a small commotion near the garages where the trucks were parked. Curiously, he jumped down from the truck and ran toward the crowd of soldiers milling about the gate. They were men from his own unit. Excited shouting split the air. "Ivan, Vasily, Comrade Prokhorov has left on leave. Prokhorov has gone. We have been waiting to tell you." The soldiers were gathering around Ivan eagerly. A general or a colonel had called their base from headquarters in Odessa with the order that Prokhorov been given immediate leave to go home. He had departed 10 minutes after the phone call, running and leaping like a crazy man, jumping on the back of a mail truck that was leaving for the train. Vladimir pushed to the front of the crowd and grabbed Ivan's arm. "The officers came out when they saw us all laughing and cheering. We told them what happened last night at the political lecture. You should have seen their faces when we said everything had turned out as you said. Vanya, Major Gedenko came out to see what was going on, and when he heard the story, he sent some soldiers off to the train to bring Prokhorov back again. They left in a spray of melting snow, skidding all the way to the front gates. They arrived at the train station to see the very end of the train disappearing in a distance. Prokhorov has gone." Major Gedenko had only a moment of impatience as he watched the scene of Moiseev return to the base through binoculars from his office window. Good thing he had ordered Moiseev brought immediately to him. With satisfaction, he observed Ivan being pulled away from the excited group and the soldiers dispersed to their work. Gedenko had assumed that after Shverlovsk, Moiseev would settle down. He had sent a communique to Commissar Dolotov in Simferopol with assurances that the matter was in hand. Yet, here was another disruption. Moiseev was achieving a kind of fame in his unit. He was popular and a good soldier, and the men were interested in him and his Baptist views. It was impossible to train a unit for military and political effectiveness with continuing incidents. There was something altogether unexplained about Moiseev. Colonel Malson, acting for Commissar Dolotov, had suggested Gedenko get to the bottom of it or arrange a transfer for Moiseev to another unit where he was not known. There was more involved in this present situation than met the eye. Moiseev must have had contacts in Odessa to have known about Prokhorov's leave. Gedenko felt depressed. These difficulties were time-consuming and involved in an uncomfortable number of men. He had lost confidence that the Moiseev problem would be easily resolved. The question of Prokhorov was another matter. He had always been politically sound. Some troublemaker had invented the story that Prokhorov had declared himself to be a believer. That could be cleared up when Prokhorov returned. It was too bad that Colonel Mason had decided to become involved. There were enough leaders in the Politburo to handle 10 Moiseevs. but Molson was particularly sensitive about religious matters. Gdenko rose and saluted as Molson's small figure came into the room. Unfortunate that Molson wouldn't leave these matters to others. If it weren't for his popularity with the men, I could have him taken care of. Molson's sharp voice pointed accusingly at Gdenko. He's an excellent chauffeur, believe me. I watch him carefully. Always on time, car in perfect condition, always sober, always correct in every way. He's even earned merit points for various offices. Merit points. And he's been in 6 or 7 months. A long time Gdenko thought for a young man to defy the authority of the Red Army. It was difficult to explain. I've seen how Baptists operate this. They are stubborn and underhanded, Molson continued. And they're secretive. But they make sure that they have good work records. They know more about the laws of our country, or think they do, more than all you political lawyers put together. Technically, according to the law, Moiseyev has committed no criminal act, Gdenko responded. No doubt he is aware of that. Gdenko opened the window of his office to let in some fresh sea air. Spring was a beautiful season in Kerch, and came early and stayed late. He took a deep breath and wished Moiseyev would arrive. Nonsense! You have me questioning your competence, Gdenko. I could have Moiseyev arrested this minute as an agitator. For one thing, there are laws, I believe, against anti-Soviet activity and the propagation of religion. Moiseyev is guilty of both. And as far as that goes, there are those occasions, as you very well know, where some laws must be set aside and one is called upon to act administratively. Gdenko disliked having to debate the colonel. Unfortunately, Moiseyev cannot be dealt with quietly. He has become the center of attention. The men in his unit must not misinterpret our actions as anti-religious, Colonel. And as for his actions being anti-Soviet, that is clear to us, of course. It may not be so clear to the men. It is not altogether a simple problem. Molson frowned irritably at Gdenko as he lit a cigarette. The case had not been handled correctly from the beginning. 5 days without food, a few hours in the snow, time enough for him to fantasize a story about angels. That was all. And now another incident again, with Moiseyev and his guard in the leading role. Molson's tense face was momentarily lit in the dim room by the flare of his match. There is a scientific explanation for Prokhorov's leave, if we can produce the facts. There are no mysteries in this world. There is only ignorance. There was a brief knock as Ivan was escorted into the room. The door shut hastily. Molson inhaled deeply. The boy was handsome enough, with chiseled features and clear, steady eyes. His expression was attentive, but set in a way Molson did not like. Moiseyev, I'll come straight to the point. I am Colonel Molson, the supreme commander of this entire base. I have reason to suspect you of subversive anti-Soviet activity in order to have known about the order which arrived at our base only this morning for the leave of Sergeant Pyotr Alexandrov Prokhorov. You would have had to work through accomplices in Odessa. Gdenko turned in his chair and gazed impassively out of the window. 4 stories below and in front of his building, he could see passing soldiers glancing up from time to time. So, word had been passed already that Moseyev was being questioned once more. It has been established that you have been attempting to draw into your religious fantasies as many soldiers as possible who do not have a strong materialistic and socialist view of life. You have been trying in every way to tear them away from productive activities and active communist creative training and labor. As your commander, I order you to desist immediately from all such activities and to fully confess your subversive activities. The major swiveled slowly to face back into the room. Moseyev had not flinched. He said nothing. First of all, Molson continued in even more brittle voice. How did you learn of Prokhorov's impending leave? There was absolutely no advance notice of it in Kerch. I require a complete explanation. Ivan's voice was steady and distinct. Comrade Colonel, I did not know that Sergeant Prokhorov would be granted a leave. God told me he would give him leave to demonstrate his existence. And God did. Molson flushed furiously, more distinctly as if he had not heard. He repeated his question. Kadenka wished he had had a drink. This was going to take a long time. The morning dragged into the early afternoon, punctuated by fury and threats, elaborate, intricate questionings on tracks familiar to Kadenka. Molson's energy seemed enormous, yet Moseyev answered quietly, sometimes waiting so long with his answers that Kadenka wondered if he were ill. Surely without breakfast and dinner, the boy would wear down. Kadenka wished he would. The session seemed endless, and he could have handled it better himself. Suddenly, Molson's deathly voice excused Moseyev to his unit. As the door closed behind him, Molson spoke through clenched teeth. His face was white with anger. "And he eats Soviet bread," he said. And that is the end for today. Next time, chapter 9. See you again.